That question begins as a whisper, so small, so fragile, so forbidden, that no one dares speak it aloud. Yet it echoes in the deepest chambers of the imperial palace, in the bones of Terra itself, in the faint trembling of the golden throne. It exists like a cold breath upon the neck of mankind, unseen but unmistakable. For 10,000 years, humanity has clung to the idea that the Emperor endures. That his will guides mankind. That his gaze keeps the nightmare at bay. But what happens when that gaze finally fades into nothing? The first sign is not something dramatic. There is no explosion of holy light, no shattering of the palace gates, no cataclysmic shockwave. Instead, it begins with a change so subtle that only the most devoted tech priests notice it. Deep within the belly of the golden throne, beneath mountains of cables, hissing conduits, and humming arcane machinery, a single reading dips by a fraction of a fraction. A measurement so ancient and so sacred that even acknowledging its fluctuation feels like heresy. The tech priests freeze, their minds calculating, their mechadendrites twitching. They recheck the data, then recheck it again. But no matter how many times they test the instruments, the truth remains the same: the golden throne is weakening. A tremor of unease passes through the maintenance crews, though no words are exchanged. They have been taught, beaten, conditioned, indoctrinated, not to speculate. To question the state of the Emperor is to risk immediate execution. Yet fear lingers in the mechanical echoes of the chambers, a fear so strong it flickers through vox channels as garbled static, as if the throne itself were exhaling a final, labored breath. Above them, in the labyrinthine halls of the imperial palace, the high lords go about their duties with a practiced, almost ritualistic certainty. For centuries, they have operated on the assumption that the Emperor will never rise but also never fall. They cling to that equilibrium, that fragile balance, because the alternative threatens everything. But on this day, even before any official report reaches them, their advisors, their guards, their psychers feel something in the air. A heaviness, a loss of psychic pressure. As if the invisible tide that once pressed constantly against reality itself has retreated by a hair's breadth. Astropaths across Terra experience it simultaneously, a momentary stutter in the Astronomicon. Only a flicker, barely a heartbeat's worth of disruption. But for psychers attuned to the psychic beacon of mankind's God Emperor, the sensation is unmistakable, like a candle guttering against the wind. Some gasp, some collapse. A few scream incoherently, speaking of shadows stretching long fingers across the warp. Most recover, but none forget. Many shake in silence, refusing to speak of what they felt. In the throne room, the Custodes stand unmoving, as they always have. Golden giants forged in loyalty, guardians of an emperor who has not spoken to them in 10,000 years. Their expressions do not change, their stances remain statuesque, but even they feel a disturbance, an almost imperceptible thinning of the psychic presence that has defined them since birth. It is like losing awareness of a heartbeat they never consciously heard until it threatened to stop. They do not speak, they do not acknowledge it, but their hands tighten ever so slightly around their guardian spears. The truth is simple, terrible, and absolute. The Emperor is not gone. But he is slipping. Across Terra, the change manifests in ways that no one consciously connects. Communications slow by fractions of seconds. Warp travel predictions suddenly require recalibration. Pilgrims in the millions feel a faint emptiness in their prayers, as though the divine ear that once heard them now listens less intently. Even the ever-present hum of Terra's atmospheric generators seems to adopt a mournful tone, weaving a low drone through the polluted skies. But the first real panic begins among the Adeptus Mechanicus. Their data cannot lie. Their sensors cannot dream. Their machines do not imagine. And the machines all agree. The Golden Throne has lost 0.1% of its stabilizing energy in a single cycle. A number so small that the untrained eye would ignore it, yet for a device that has never fluctuated in 10,000 years, it is catastrophic. Something impossible is happening, something irreversible. Still, no alarm is sounded. No warning is sent. The ruling hierarchy fears the idea even more than the data. If they speak it aloud, it becomes real. If they acknowledge the emperor's decline, they risk collapsing an empire built entirely on his endurance. And so the first instinct of every High Lord, every tech priest, every inquisitor who senses the truth is the same: hide it. But reality does not disappear because powerful men refuse to see it. The Golden Throne continues its slow decline. The Astronomicon flickers again, longer this time. Astropaths across Terra bleed from their eyes. A few burst into flames, consumed by psychic backlash. The damage spreads through the warp like ripples through black water, subtle but undeniable. And yet, still, silence. No announcements. No warnings. Nothing but the quiet terror of those who know the truth but dare not speak it. In the deepest vaults beneath the throne room, far from the chanting priests, the roaring machinery, and the unending prayers, lies a secret known only to the highest echelons of the Mechanicus. A single monitor displays the Emperor's remaining psychic output. A number. A simple number. For the first time in history, it ticks downward. Slowly. Relentlessly. Irrevocably. If the Emperor never wakes up. For the first time, that question is no longer heresy. It is a possibility. And in the cold heart of the Golden Throne, the ancient machine groans, as if sensing that the being it sustains has slipped farther away than ever before. The first lie is spoken behind a sealed adamantium door, in a chamber where the air smells of incense, old blood, and the iron scent of fear. The High Lords gather in a semicircle of authority, their faces half hidden by shadow and ceremonial regalia. These are the men and women who rule humanity in the Emperor's name, yet none dare to utter the truth that is clawing at their minds. It sits between them like a silent, waiting predator. The Emperor is failing. Every High Lord senses it, even those who have not yet received the Mechanicus reports. They feel it in the uneasy tremor of Terra's psychic field, in the shifting behavior of the navigators, and most importantly, in their own hearts, though they will never admit such weakness. The Fabricator General is the first to break the silence. His voice is metallic, filtered through layers of vox modulation, yet the crack in it is unmistakable. He presents the data: a drop in throne stability, a decrease in psychic output, anomalous activity across throne subsystems. He reveals none of the more sensitive readings. Those numbers are too terrifying, too damning, but even the sanitized figures are enough to drain the color from several faces. The master of the administratum tries to challenge the data, insisting it must be a calibration error. The Fabricator General corrects him, calmly, clinically, ruthlessly. The Golden Throne does not produce errors. Not of this magnitude. Not ever. A hush falls over the chamber, so deep that even the rustle of robes becomes a thunderous intrusion. Every High Lord understands the implications. If the Emperor's psychic presence continues to fade, the Astronomicon will collapse. Warp travel will become almost impossible. Astropaths will go blind, mad, or worse. The Imperium, already a colossal beast of rust and inertia, will fall apart instantly, devouring itself as communications break down and sectors drift into isolation. The nightmares lurking in the void will smell the blood in the water and descend with unstoppable hunger. Yet even with these apocalyptic possibilities looming over them, none speak of alerting the Imperium. None discuss warning the Astartes chapters. None suggest preparing the populace. They know what such an announcement would bring: riots, rebellions, civil wars, doomsday cults erupting into madness. The Imperium survives on belief that the Emperor watches, protects, judges. If that belief shatters, no amount of force can hold billions of worlds together. So instead, they choose the one option that feels safe. The one option that feels comfortable. The one option mankind has used for millennia whenever disaster looms. They lie. The master of the Astra Militarum voices the official decision: the Emperor is stable. The fluctuations are temporary. There is no cause for alarm. These words are spoken with authority, but inside, every High Lord feels the hollowness of the declaration. They know this lie will not stop the decline. It will not repair the golden throne. It will not restore the emperor's strength. All it will do is slow the inevitable panic, delay the inevitable collapse, postpone the moment when humanity must confront the terror of a future without its God. But that delay, that single moment of breathing room, is valuable. Power clings to survival above all else, and so the lie becomes doctrine. Reports are sealed, data is restricted, tech priests are threatened, astropaths who felt the Astronomicon stutter are quietly removed under the guise of instability. Even the Custodes receive only a half-truth, delivered in language so carefully crafted it feels more like a prayer than a briefing. They say the Emperor's light has faltered, yes, but only slightly, only momentarily, and only because of warp turbulence. The Custodes do not respond. They do not argue. They do not threaten. But they know. They have known for weeks. Still, they remain silent, not out of obedience to the High Lords, but out of loyalty to the Emperor. They will not spread panic. They will wait. They will watch. And they will act only when necessary. As the meeting drags on, bitter factions begin to form. The preservationists insist that everything must continue exactly as it has for millennia. To change anything would be sacrilege. The ascensionist bloc argues for preparing contingency leadership, hinting that a new figure must eventually rise to guide humanity. The radicals speak the forbidden thought: perhaps the Emperor is already dead, and the Imperium sustains only the echo of his power. Their words trigger outrage, denial, and whispers of treason. But even amid these ideological conflicts, all factions agree on one thing. The truth must not leave this room. When the meeting finally adjourns, each lord departs with a mask of serene authority, but their private escorts see the tension in their steps, the stiffness in their shoulders, the shadow in their eyes. Fear radiates from them like a sickly aura. They know they are standing at the edge of a precipice, and any wrong move could send the entire Imperium plummeting into darkness. Outside the chamber, Terra continues its endless march. Fleets depart. Pilgrims chant. Administrators shuffle papers in endless bureaucratic cycles. Billions live their lives under the comforting illusion that the Emperor is eternal. That he still watches over them. That everything is under control. But deep beneath the surface, in hidden vaults and forbidden databanks, the terrible truth lurks like a coiled serpent. The Emperor is slipping away, and the Golden Throne can no longer hold him. And now the highest powers of mankind have chosen to bury this truth beneath silence and secrecy. The first lie has been spoken, and it will not be the last. Even as the High Lords seal away the truth beneath layers of secrecy and denial, the galaxy itself begins to feel the shift. War has always been the heartbeat of the Imperium, steady, relentless, eternal. But now that pulse falters, stumbling like a wounded giant struggling to keep its footing. Across a million battlefronts, commanders and soldiers alike sense something intangible pressing down on them, as though the very air has thickened, as though hope has thinned. They cannot explain it, they cannot name it, but they feel it, unmistakably, in the marrow of their bones. On distant worlds, Imperial Guard regiments march through mud and fire, fighting enemies they have been conditioned to hate since birth. Yet their victories feel hollow, their losses sharper. Messages from command arrive slower than usual, distorted, crackling, half-swallowed by static. Navigators begin requesting recalculations for warp jumps, claiming the Astronomicon feels inconsistent, uncertain, dim. Their warnings are dismissed. They are told to adjust their rituals, strengthen their focus, and trust in the Emperor's light. But those words, once spoken with absolute conviction, now feel strangely fragile. The light they rely on is flickering, subtly, but undeniably. Whispers spread in frontline barracks. Veterans murmur that the warp feels wrong. Transit times stretch. Ships arrive late or not at all. Entire battle groups vanish without explanation, chalked up to warp anomalies or Xenos ambushes. These justifications have always existed, always been plausible, yet they carry a new weight now. A darker resonance. Something is changing out there in the void. Astartes chapters, scattered across the stars, respond to this strange tension in their own ways. Some become more aggressive, launching crusades with renewed ferocity, desperate to reinforce the belief that humanity remains strong. Others grow cautious, sensing the subtle spiritual imbalance as if their gene-coded instincts have detected a storm approaching. Chaplains report unsettling visions: a burning galaxy, a silent throne, a shadow stretching across the astronomican like a hand smothering a flame. These visions are classified, buried beneath ritual and denial, but they spread nonetheless. Astartes are not easily afraid, yet many feel a coldness beneath their transhuman calm. Among the common citizens of the Imperium, unease manifests in strange and scattered ways. Shrine worlds experience a surge in confessions, prayers, and desperate pilgrimages. People speak of feeling unwatched, a sensation so alien that priests struggle to soothe them. On some worlds, reports of ghostly dreams multiply, visions of a great golden figure dissolving into dust, or a vast darkness encroaching from the edges of the sky. Administrators attribute this to stress, to war, to planetary hardship. But fear is contagious, and the dreams spread faster than any official can contain. Astropaths, the soul-bound channels of interstellar communication, suffer the most. They begin to hear echoes, distant echoes, where before there was clarity. Messages twist, warp, or fragment. Some astropaths complain that the astronomican has developed an intermittent skip, like a heartbeat missing occasional beats. Others describe moments of profound silence, as though the psychic beacon simply vanishes for a fraction of a second before returning with a shudder of distorted light. These anomalies are reported, logged, and then buried, filed under temporary warp turbulence. But the astropaths know better. They feel the Emperor's presence weakening, slipping through their spiritual grasp like sand through fingers. The warp itself reflects this change. In areas closest to Terra, currents waver unpredictably. In distant sectors, warp storms flare briefly, swallowing entire systems in bursts of madness before receding. The navigator houses, those ancient dynasties who guide humanity through the psychic tides, quietly begin to panic. Their collective awareness, bound to the astronomican like countless minds tethered to a single source, detects fluctuations they have never encountered. Some become ill. Others refuse to travel, claiming the warp feels starved, hungry, or watching. Their language becomes poetic, fearful, almost childlike, as though they are trying to describe something that defies words. Even the enemies of mankind notice the shift. Eldar farseers pause mid-scrying as their runes vibrate with strange resonance. Toe diplomats observe that Imperial forces seem unusually hesitant. Orc war bosses bellow with excitement, sensing weakness in the armies. And in the black heart of the Eye of Terror, demons howl with anticipation, tasting a faint odor drifting into the warp, the scent of a fading god. But for the Imperium itself, none of this holds meaning in the moment. It is simply war. War without end. War that blurs days into decades, centuries into dust. But beneath that familiar rhythm lies a deeper dissonance, a tremor heralding the collapse of a pillar so vast, so foundational, that the galaxy cannot imagine life without it. The Emperor has not spoken for 10,000 years. But now, for the first time, he feels silent. And though the High Lords hide the truth carefully, meticulously, desperately, the galaxy itself begins to understand. Not through proclamations or messages or confessions, but through instinct, through dread, through the inexplicable certainty that something sacred is dying. The Imperium continues its wars. But the light guiding those wars grows weaker with every passing moment. And soon, the consequences will no longer be subtle. The Inquisition is always watching. It watches the High Lords. It watches the Mechanicus. It watches the Astartes. It watches the people. And when something shifts in the galaxy, something subtle yet catastrophic, it is the Inquisition that feels it first. Their minds are trained to sense threats not just in what is stated openly, but in what is carefully avoided, what is whispered, what is feared. And now, everywhere they listen, they hear the same thing: silence. Not peace, not stillness, silence. An absence so profound it feels like a void-swallowing sound, light, truth. The first to react is the Ordo Hereticus. Their agents, stationed in every corner of the Imperium, intercept troubling messages from astropathic choirs. Reports of psychic inconsistency. Confessions of doubt. Priests preaching that the Emperor's voice has become faint. These are seeds of heresy, and the Ordo Hereticus knows the danger they pose. Doubt spreads faster than fire. They dispatch operatives to silence rumors, execute preachers who question too loudly, and burn archives containing references to astronomical fluctuations. But even as they purge, the Hereticus agents feel unease growing in their own hearts. They can punish doubt, but they cannot erase the cause of it. The Ordo Malleus, dedicated to fighting demonic horrors, senses something different, an atmospheric change in the warp itself. Their most seasoned demon hunters report that the veil feels thinner, the warp currents more chaotic, as if something vast is stirring beneath the surface. Inquisitors who have faced demons hundreds of times suddenly find their wards flickering unexpectedly. Rituals that once hummed with certainty now vibrate with instability. They feel the Emperor's protective presence dimming long before the Mechanicus ever dares to speak it aloud. And their conclusion is immediate, chilling, undeniable: chaos is gathering. Not with the subtlety of infiltration or temptation, but with the ravenous hunger of predators who smell blood. The Ordo Xenos responds not to warp instabilities, but to patterns, pure data. Alien behavior across multiple sectors becomes erratic. Tyrannid fleets shift direction with unprecedented coordination, as though drawn by a scent no human can detect. Necron tomb worlds awaken earlier than predicted. Even the Eldar, elusive and aloof, make startling moves. Entire craft worlds change course, their seers sending cryptic warnings into human space before vanishing again into the void. And then there were the worlds that broke entirely. Planets where the light of the Astronomicon dimmed for a moment too long, and warp storms swallowed star systems whole. Planets where heresy erupted like wildfire, fueled by the faint psychic whisper of entities eager to exploit humanity's fear. Planets where the people realized, with a terror beyond comprehension, that they were truly alone. But the most disastrous shift happened at the very top. The High Lords of Terra, those ancient, scheming powers behind the curtain, began to turn on each other. With the Emperor reduced to a silent relic, there was no longer a true judge, no absolute authority to enforce unity. Every decree became a matter of interpretation. Every policy ignited conflict. Every whisper of doubt became a weapon. Some High Lords argued the Imperium needed a new leader, not a replacement for the Emperor, but a more functional voice to interpret his will. Others called this treason, claiming such an idea was the first step toward abandoning their god entirely. The tension grew so severe that inquisitors, once united under his name, now hunted each other for ideological impurity. All because the Emperor did not wake. All because the throne's silence became impossible to ignore. All because humanity had tethered its soul to a corpse that refused to rise. And as these fractures grew, something else stirred in the warp, something subtle, patient, and disturbingly familiar. For while the Emperor could no longer act, his enemies had never truly stopped watching. They could sense the weakening faith, the splintering unity, the quiet tremors of despair spreading through the species that had once defied them with divine fire. Humanity did not know it yet, but the galaxy was approaching a point of no return. And the Emperor's eternal silence was no longer an inconvenience. It was becoming a weapon, one being used against mankind with exquisite precision. The galaxy was beginning to understand the truth. If the Emperor never wakes, humanity's greatest enemy is not chaos. It is the belief that he someday will. Whispers began on the fringes of the Imperium. Places where oversight was thin, where administratum clerks visited once every few centuries, where entire populations lived and died without ever seeing an imperial official. On these remote worlds, truth seeped through cracks like poisoned water. It started with small inconsistencies, rituals that no longer produced visions, relics that ceased to glow, astropaths who felt, blind spots, where the astronomicon used to shine like a sun. And then word slipped from dying psychers, burned out by the strain of feeding the golden throne. He is fading, some screamed before their eyes melted. He no longer sees us, others croaked, their voices hollow and echoing. The Emperor is gone, whispered the ones too weak to scream. Such statements would have once been dismissed as madness born of warp exposure. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. Too many psychers, too many identical last words, too many identical horrors. The Imperium had always been a realm of enforced faith, but suddenly it faced a faith that threatened to collapse on its own. The Inquisition acted swiftly. Entire astropathic choirs were incinerated for corruption. Shrines were sealed. Prophets were silenced. Whole hives were mind-scrubbed and re-indoctrinated. But the more the Inquisition tried to douse the fire, the hotter it burned. Because silence was not enough. Ignorance was not enough. Fear was not enough. Humanity had sensed something was wrong, and once a shadow of doubt is cast upon a god, no amount of burning can erase it. Across the segmentum solar, the ecclesiarchy began pushing a new doctrine, one meant to counter rising doubt. They called it the eternal vigilance doctrine, a proclamation that the emperor's silence was proof of his sacrifice. They preached that his unresponsiveness was not weakness but deliberate endurance. That his stillness was not decline but divine restraint. They shouted this doctrine so loudly, with such forced certainty, that even the devout sensed desperation behind the words. The people were expected to accept it without question. But people talk, people listen, people think, and on the worlds just outside Terra's influence, dangerous interpretations formed. If the Emperor has truly chosen eternal silence, some asked, then who truly leads mankind? And why must we obey? But the darkest question of all was whispered only in secret, behind locked doors and sound-dampening wards. What if the Emperor never wakes, because he can't? That single thought was a blade aimed at the heart of the Imperium. And once the idea took root, it slithered through society like a parasite. A rising movement emerged, quiet, subtle, heretical. They called themselves the Great Communion. Not chaos worshippers, not atheists, not rebels, just realists, people who believed that humanity must prepare for life without a god. They preached self-reliance, not faith. They preached unity through rationality, not devotion. They preached that the Emperor's dream had been noble, but that dreams inevitably end. Their message spread like wildfire, especially among those who had seen war firsthand. Imperial Guard veterans, disillusioned officials, scarred survivors of demon incursions, they listened, and for the first time in their lives, the message made sense. The Imperium responded predictably. Decrees of damnation, planetary purges, death by fire. But the Great Communion did not resist with guns or riots. They resisted with ideas. And ideas are much harder to kill. Meanwhile, the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's angels of death, began to fracture not physically but philosophically. Some chapters doubled down on zealotry, clinging to dogma like drowning men clutching driftwood. Others grew distant from Terra, asserting independence under the guise of practicality. A few, the most secretive of all, started quietly exploring a forbidden thought. Should we create a new figurehead? A new emperor, not to replace him, but to protect humanity in his stead? Such a suggestion was treason. Yet it lingered in their war councils like a ghost no one could banish. The galaxy continued turning, and with every rotation, the cracks widened. Faith was no longer universal. Unity no longer certain. Obedience no longer automatic. And far beyond the borders of the Imperium, the ruinous powers watched with unnatural patience. They did not need to attack. Not yet. The Imperium was weakening itself, tearing its own belief system apart from within. They simply waited for the perfect moment, when faith had thinned just enough, when despair had ripened enough, when humanity was most vulnerable. Because faith had always been the Imperium's greatest shield. And now, that shield was beginning to crumble. Not shattered by war, not broken by demons, but dissolved by doubt, a force far more insidious than any sword. And as belief slowly drained from the hearts of billions, the warp began to stir in anticipation. Because if the Emperor never wakes, then something else might. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's presence in the warp had been like a blazing sun, muted, distorted, and agonized, yes, but undeniably powerful. His radiance pushed back the tides of chaos, held the worst nightmares at bay, and created a psychic structure around which human souls instinctively clung. Even in his silence, he was a wall, an anchor, a force. But now, that wall was fracturing. That anchor was loosening, and the warp felt it. When the Emperor began fading, it wasn't like a star dying in a violent supernova. It was quieter, more like the long, slow dimming of a lantern running out of fuel. And just like predators emerging as twilight becomes night, the entities lurking in the Imperium sensed opportunity. At first, it was nothing more than whispers. Faint thoughts drifting through the minds of psychers. Half-formed dreams. Moments of déjà vu that left people shaken, as though something had brushed their consciousness without touching it. A shadow moved through the warp, slow, deliberate, and ancient. It was not one of the Chaos Gods. No, those beings shrieked and roared, devouring emotion with animal greed. This presence was different. It was patient, focused, a silhouette that had been waiting for exactly this moment. For millennia, the Emperor's psychic fire had kept it at bay. Now, the embers waned. Across the galaxy, psychers began reporting the same vision, a colossal figure made of writhing darkness, crowned with a ring of pale, sickly light. Some claimed it spoke in a voice that was not a voice at all, a vibration felt in their bones, a coldness threading through their dreams. Others simply screamed until their minds shattered. The Inquisition banned all discussion of the phenomenon. They classified it under a new and terrifying designation, warp signature nullis omega. But they could not ban the fear. Fear spreads faster than truth. Fear sinks deeper than doctrine. Fear opens doors, and the warp, hungry and eager, was pushing against those doors. On Terra, the Astronomicon began to stutter more frequently. Each flicker of instability sent ripples through the Imperium, like a lighthouse beam sputtering during a storm. Navigators trembled. Some lost their minds mid-voyage. Whole convoys disappeared into the tides, lost to madness, demons, or something far worse. Because without the Emperor's full strength, the warp was changing. Not simply growing stronger. Not simply becoming wilder. No, its shape was changing. For eons, the Astronomicon had acted like a gravitational anchor, pinning parts of the warp into a semi-stable state. It did not cure madness, but it created predictable patterns, currents that human navigators had learned to map. Without it, the warp was unraveling like a tapestry being pulled apart thread by thread. New storms formed, old ones spread, the boundaries between warp and real space thinned. On some worlds, strange phenomena erupted without warning. People woke up screaming with memories they had never lived. Shadows moved independently of their owners. Voices whispered from mirrors that no longer reflected the correct image. Children were born with eyes that glowed like dying stars. But the most horrifying sign of all came from a black ship trapped in an unexpected warp surge. When its astropaths finally managed to broadcast a distress signal before vanishing forever, their last words chilled the Imperium to its core. Something is coming. Something older than chaos. Something that was always there, waiting. The Grey Communion seized upon these events as proof of their philosophy. The Emperor is not dying, they claimed. He is letting go. A new age is beginning. Humanity must evolve or perish. The Ecclesiarchy countered with a new holy decree, the War of Faithful Souls, a spiritual mobilization meant to rekindle belief through ferocity. Billions flocked to their cathedrals, chanting for deliverance that did not come. Yet both sides, heretic and believer, skeptic and zealot, felt the same cold presence stirring in the night. It touched their dreams. It coiled behind their thoughts. It whispered promises of power, unity, redemption, or destruction. And all the while, the golden throne itself emitted a strange new resonance. A slow, rhythmic pulse. Not failing, not breaking, answering something. Deep in the labyrinth beneath the palace, the tech priests detected unknown psychic frequencies rippling through the throne's ancient circuitry. Frequencies matching nothing in their records, nothing known to mankind, nothing permitted to exist. The throne was reacting to the presence in the warp. But was it resisting, or was it responding? As the Emperor's light continued to dim, the warp grew darker, yet something in that darkness began to shine with dreadful purpose. And humanity, suspended between fading divinity and rising nightmare, stood on the edge of a revelation it was not prepared to face. Because if the Emperor never wakes, the galaxy will not simply lose its protector. It will gain a new contender. A presence that has waited 10,000 years for this moment. A shadow, stepping into the light. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had defined itself through contradiction, unyielding yet decaying, almighty yet desperate, eternal yet crumbling. It was an empire balanced on a corpse, held together with faith, fear, and the faintest flicker of psychic light. But now, that light was almost gone. The Emperor had not spoken in millennia. He had not moved. He had not awakened. He had not risen to save Terra from countless horrors. But across the galaxy, a moment had arrived, an hour whispered of only in forbidden texts and buried prophecies. The last night of the Emperor's presence. The final ebb of his psychic tide. The throne's glow dimmed for the first time in recorded history. Not flickered. Not sputtered. Dimmed. Tech priests collapsed in terror as readings exceeded anything in their archives. The alarms that activated deep beneath the palace had not sounded since the great heresy itself, since the day the Emperor was entombed. Ignored for millennia, long written off as outdated myths, those alarms now screamed like dying beasts. Entire temples fell into chaos. Choirs of psychers burst into flame without a single scream. The warp pulse resonating from the golden throne intensified until the stone foundations of the imperial palace cracked like brittle bone. Something was happening, something irreversible. In the dark heart of Terra, the High Lords gathered in a chamber they had prayed would never open. The last council of man, a room sealed by the Emperor himself during the earliest days of the Imperium. Records of its purpose were vague, contradictory, perhaps deliberately obscured. Some said it was a chamber of prophecy. Others insisted it was a place where the Emperor's final command would be revealed. Others whispered it was a tomb for secrets too dangerous to ever see daylight. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Even the air seemed heavy with expectation. The lords bowed their heads, waiting for an answer they feared would never come. But the throne answered. A single, ancient groan echoed across the galaxy through the warp, a psychic tremor felt by every psyker, every navigator, every soul attuned to the Imperium. Billions of humans dropped to their knees at the same instant, clutching their skulls as if something immense had brushed their minds. On Cadia's remains, guardsmen screamed as the stars seemed to bend. On holy Mars, the Mechanicus fell prostrate as machine spirits held in terror. On Macragge, the Ultramarines felt a spike of psychic pressure so sharp it drew blood. On Baal, visions of a golden figure dissolving into dust washed over every mortal and Astartes alike. And in the warp, the shadow smiled. The Emperor was not dead. But he was no longer holding the line. The barriers he had maintained, the flames he had tended, the shields he had forged, all were failing. Not shattered, not destroyed, but simply released. He was withdrawing from the front lines of metaphysical war, shrinking inward, retreating into some unreachable place. For the first time in 10,000 years, the warp felt his absence fully. And it surged forward, a tide eager to reclaim what had been denied to it for millennia. Warp storms erupted instantaneously across the galaxy. Entire sectors vanished in storms of prismatic insanity. Demonic incursions multiplied without warning. Black ships disappeared without a trace, their crews swallowed by the screaming dark. The Astronomicon dimmed to half strength. Then a quarter. Then lower. Navigators stared into the warp and saw no guiding star, just chaos and something worse. Structure, intention, a shape moving through the maelstrom like a leviathan rising from a midnight sea. The shadow that had lingered for centuries had grown bolder. It now coalesced into something with form. Not a god, not a demon, something older, something deeper, something that had no name in any human language. But in the shrieking dialect of the warp, it was known as the Witness. Some claimed it had been present even before the birth of chaos. Others argued it was born from humanity's fear, doubt, and failing faith, a counterforce to the Emperor himself. Others believed it had been waiting for the moment when humanity's God faltered, so that it could step forward and take his place. And now, it was coming. Across the galaxy, the Great Communion openly declared the beginning of a new era. Their leaders, once mere political dissenters, now experienced visions from the Witness, visions promising a future without gods, without tyranny, without chains. A future shaped by human will rather than divine mandate. The Ecclesiarchy responded with a last, desperate decree. The final crusade of light. Billions marched beneath banners depicting a silent emperor, begging for a miracle that would not come. Astarte's chapters split along ideological lines. Brothers turned on brothers. The Imperium fractured. Faith collapsed. Truth bled through every wound. And on Terra, amid collapsing systems, screaming alarms, burning sanctuaries, the Golden Throne fell silent. Not broken, not extinguished, just quiet. For the first time in 10,000 years, every sound within the throne room died. And then, with agonizing slowness, a single hairline crack appeared across the Emperor's skull, dry, ancient, almost fossilized. The High Lords watched in paralyzed horror. The corpse did not twitch. The eyes did not open. The breath did not return. But something left the body. A shimmer, a flicker of light, a streak of golden radiance that slipped into the warp like a final whisper of divinity. The Emperor's last psychic spark had gone out into the Imperium, not as salvation, but as a message, or perhaps a warning. Because as that light vanished, the dark figure waiting in the heart of the warp finally stepped forward, casting a shadow so vast it engulfed stars. Humanity looked to the heavens for guidance. The heavens looked back with hunger. And somewhere, in the deepest, most ancient trench of the warp, the Emperor's fading spark drifted alone, small, cold, nearly extinguished. Yet it did not die. Not yet, for though the Emperor would never wake again, his last ember still burned with a question that echoed through the fabric of reality. If I cannot rise, who will stand in my place? The galaxy trembled, awaiting the answer. And in the silence that followed, only one thing was certain. The Imperium as humanity had known it, had come to its end. But humanity's story was far from over. A new age was beginning, an age forged not by gods, but by the consequences of their silence.